Hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Renee Gotch Christensen. Thank you so much for joining us today on February 22nd, 2021, as Urban Butterfly Omaha presents a lunch and learn with Nebraska's District 6 candidate, Naomi Hattaway. Urban Butterfly Omaha is an online collection, donation, and delivery platform where excess meets needs and the redistribution of knowledge and clothing and essentials in, by, and for the Omaha community. We feature an online giveaway, an all free marketplace, pathways to essential services, pop up free street stores for the poor and the homeless, and renewable clothing partnerships with community nonprofits along the continuum of care. Urban Butterfly Omaha is a gathering of a growing, engaged, and compassionate community of urban butterflies who together form a kaleidoscope of direct action designed to help those in need. We are a nonprofit for the people and by the people. To learn more about our mission, to donate funds, or to receive help, contact urbanbutterfly.org today. You can also find us on Facebook at Urban Butterfly Omaha. We at Urban Butterfly Omaha believe education and truth is the key to understanding one another. As the late Martin Luther King Jr. once said, an individual has not started living until he can rise above the narrow confines of his individualistic concerns to the broader concerns of all humanity. We at Urban Butterfly Omaha feel it is time to bring that type of mindset to District 6, Nebraska. We ask that you join us with an open mind and a peaceful heart as together we learn about a human being, Naomi Hattaway, taking on the astronomical challenge of running for District 6 City Council. We look forward to gaining knowledge of who she is and where together her policies can take us. At this time, we ask that all viewers place themselves on mute. We also ask that if you have a comment, question, or concern, you use the chat box to communicate, and this way we are not talking all over one another. Now, without further ado, I would like to pass our lunch and learn off to our interviewer, Alex Bauer. Alex and Naomi, thank you so much for joining us today. The floor is yours.
For Omaha City Council. My wife and I are also proud business owners in Omaha City Council District 5. And so I just wanted to put that little plug in there for you, that just because you live in a different district, in a different jurisdiction than a candidate that you are really passionate about, that doesn't disqualify you from supporting that candidate, volunteering for them, working with them as staff, and which is all to say that I am a proud supporter of Naomi Hattaway for Omaha City Council District 6. And Naomi, I hope that you will learn and take away from this conversation today, leads with integrity and honesty and radical transparency. And I hope that you all will consider supporting her along with me and some of the other folks on this call. So welcome, Naomi. It's so good to see you, friend.
It's good to see you too. Thanks for being patient. Today's a big work day, so I appreciate your patience.
Yeah, well, welcome. And thank you all so much for taking your lunch hour to sit and chat with us. So I'll kind of jump in here. And so just to give you a little bit of a run of the agenda, I have some questions here for Naomi that she and I will just kind of have a chat, and then towards the end of the conversation, we'll leave some space for you all to ask some of your questions. And so if you have them in your mind and you want to throw them in the chat so you don't lose them or write them down, we'll have time at the end for that. So without any further ado, Naomi, can you tell folks a little bit about yourself and why you decided to run for Omaha City Council?
Yeah, so as Alex mentioned, my name is Naomi Hattaway, and I'm running for District 6, which is for the Omaha City Council, basically Dodge to Center Street and about 85th Street to the Elkhorn River. I was born and raised in North Platte, moved to Omaha as a child. My dad was one of the first Black engineers for Union Pacific back in the 70s, and that's all I'll say about how old I am. Around there, grew up as a homeschooled student. Before the Nebraska Board of Education said that it was a viable form of education. And so those two things, being a Black biracial kiddo and then being homeschooled, has really given me a unique space to kind of stand in two worlds. To add to that, when I moved to Omaha, we experienced, living in poverty. We were not, it wasn't harsh. It was what we thought was just our normal. So I bring that to the table as well. We lived overseas for a while when I met my husband and got married. We lived in Asia, so 3 years in New Delhi, India, and then a year in Singapore, and found our way back to Omaha in 2017. And we chose Elkhorn. And so, went from North Omaha to overseas, all over the United States, and then back to West Omaha. I have been wanting to get into policy. I don't know that I wanted to get into politics necessarily, but policy. I see there being some really, really good opportunities to inject equity into the way that we write policy. And I thought for a while that that would be accomplished through work in the nonprofit space. So I've been doing that work mostly in housing. And found very quickly that I wanted to be a part of rewriting policy because that was the way that I felt that I could have the biggest impact. 2020 happened, to the entire world, but to keep it here local, it was interesting to me to watch Omaha start to grapple with racism and inequity and inequality and all of those things, especially as a West Omahan. I think that there's a lot of space for awareness to be brought in. So anyway, a long story to basically say I'm running for office because I am uniquely positioned to be able to help guide West Omaha through leadership and through my proactive response to things like racism and equity, and talking about things that are messy like affordable housing and how we can be good neighbors to each other. So there you go.
Thank you so much, Naomi. What a warm way to start our conversation. And I think another one of the things that really drew me to Naomi is that we both share that we grew up in rural Nebraska. I'm originally from Valentine, which North Platte was always kind of the center point that we told folks that the nearest Walmart was 2 hours away, and that was in North Platte. And I think that makes you also uniquely positioned in Elkhorn, right? For the Omaha City Council, is there's a sense of there being these small towns within the broader community. And I think that growing up in a rural small town, you really understand how community works and how those relationships are really important. And so just another reason that I feel very lucky to know you. So so there's a lot of different races that you could have run for, right? So what made you want to run for the city council over another local or state or even federal office?
Yeah, well, state and federal feel big and scary, I think, sometimes. And I knew that, in politics, there is some, get your feet wet or run for something first before you try something bigger. I don't think that that's why I didn't want to go for a state or federal office, though. I had actually considered the Elkhorn School Board, the Elkhorn Public School District, or the Elkhorn School District School Board first. But when I really dug into what issues mattered the most to me, it aligned with the things that the city council has oversight with. And I think that the other piece around wanting to run for city council was that it's a race that's unique because there's just the two of us. I knew that, and there's someone on this call who knows this very well. There's not a lot of folks that are willing to run in West Omaha. And so I knew that it would likely be just me and the incumbent. And that gives me a really unique advantage to be running. Other city council districts have wide pools of very qualified candidates, which is great, but I function best when I know who my opponent is. And so it's really been great to be able to dig in really deeply and very specifically to counterbalance his inaction and his lack of proactive leadership. I think that there's also from a city council standpoint, it is the one place that impacts our daily life the most. And I also value education so much in the sense of building awareness around why local politics matter. Federal and state are the kind of sexy politics, and they're the ones that we want to get involved with or hear about anyway, or talk about. But local politics impact every day, and I wanted to be a part of that.
Super. Thank you so much. And so speaking from that transparency and bringing awareness, your campaign has really fostered a culture of transparency and honesty, not only within us as staff and volunteers, but also with the broader constituency, whether that's campaign finance or saying this is who has access to voter information and this is who doesn't. Can you chat about why that's so important to you and your team?
Yeah. So one of the things that I value, there's a phrase it's ancora imparo, and it's Latin for "yet I am learning," and it has been my mantra my entire life. And I think that it's important to bring that into politics as well. And in this campaign, there's so much shame around not knowing enough, and that could be for whatever topic, but especially around politics. And so the more I talk to voters and the more I talk to folks that want to be engaged, if we can reduce that shame by providing education on the front end or providing transparency on the front end, it helps us all step into spaces a little bit more bravely. So that can be as simple as talking about acronyms. So if I would normally say, like a lot of candidates would just kind of throw around the acronym SID, we are always cognizant of then explaining what that means casually, so that it's not talking down to anyone. So SIDs, which means sanitary improvement district, or I see Michael put in the chat and said a comment about NIMBY, which is not in my backyard. So we just very casually and as plain language as we can bring awareness to what local politics mean and the acronyms and such. From your standpoint about asking around campaign finance, so Nebraska has an accountability and disclosure commission, and they require that we report campaign finances, and so who donates and how much, but under $249, it's not reportable. So often candidates won't report that. We have decided to talk about those dollar amounts. We don't release the names because that's not our business, but we do talk about the full amount that's been donated to our campaign. And why that matters is because I think that there are so many folks that are kept in the dark around how campaigns work. The other reason it's important to us is because we want folks to know where their $15 or their $25 is going. So we break it down almost into campaign cycles. So right now we're working on reaching apartment folks and renters. And so we know that if you give us $5, we know how many that translates to apartment or renters that we can reach. So I don't know if that answered fully your question.
Yeah, I think you totally did. And I think that another one of the things that you uplifted, that is another trend that I think we're especially seeing from femme candidates is this understanding that you don't have to be all-knowing to be in a space of policy. The only all-knowing is dependent on your religious beliefs and whether that there's an all-knowing being out there somewhere. And so I think that's a really important position to not only put the public in, that you don't have to be all-knowing to engage in policy, but I think it's also important for us to understand that decision makers aren't going to be all-knowing, but coming from a place of learning and from a place of understanding and doing the will of the people is really their job, right?
Well, and I think, Alex, to that point, so I think what we see a lot of is folks that are elected who forget to bring the other smart people along. We have a lot of smart people in Omaha, whether that is around the affordable housing space or language access for city government, TIF, all of the things that are headline. We've got people that we can bring into the conversation. And I think that is, you're right. The candidates that are out there right now are really openly talking about, I may not know all of the things, but I promise and commit that I'll ask. Or even greater than asking is bringing them along for the conversation. We see the mayor, there's advisory committees, which sound good in theory. And I would love to see us actually make those a little bit more intentional, where there's some leadership given and some choices that actually impact our city when we ask people to be part of those advisory committees.
Yeah, totally. And I think another thing that you uplifted, and I know is a conversation within your campaign and within especially groups like Women Who Run and these kind of grassroots organizing is creating that transparency so that people who come after you who would like to run for office have a base level of knowledge that they wouldn't have otherwise, and also continue to foster that transparency and education, not just in your race, but in races in the future. So really, really appreciate that, Naomi. So in the national scene and even in local races and state races, we see this word radical thrown around a lot in policy conversations and political races. So can you talk about what radical means to you and how you think that defines or doesn't define your campaign for city council?
Yeah, I think that running a race in 2021, just by virtue of making that decision, is radical by itself. I think that radical has a different definition than it might have even a year ago. There's a great quote that we are going to be releasing into our campaign soon. It's an Angela Davis quote, and it says, "Radical simply means grasping something by its roots." And I think that really grounds the term radical. To the point of really making it intentional. So it's not some wild, harebrained idea or something that is scary or oppressive when we think of something that's radical. It just means being willing to sit with the problem and getting intentional about what it is that the solutions need to be. And so if we look at that as the definition, I'm here for being radical all day long. And I think that there's some space too around just redefining what we think about when we think about politics. And part of what I'm here for is redefining the way that our city council looks. There's, obviously a visual perception of who someone is and what identities I would be bringing to the council. There's also invisible identities. I identify as disabled. That is not something that you would normally assume by looking at me, but I just am excited to see some radical change when it comes to who's on our city council. When we have people that are elected that are close to the problems, have experienced the problems, or are simply willing to understand and be empathetic to the problems, we can actually start to see some change. So I adopt the term radical.
Yeah, and I think when I think about that Angela Davis quote, I think of, that's what we should all be doing. We should all be in the nonprofit sector, in the private sector, and in government and public spheres. We should all be coming from that systems lens of saying, here are all of the symptoms to the problems, and here are all of the band-aids that we have. If we go upstream to all of these things that are creating these systematic challenges and inequities in our community, we don't have to, then there won't be the band-aids, then there won't be all of this downstream turmoil that we're having in our communities. And so I'm with you. If that's what redefining radical is, then I'm on board. So to Michael's question, you spent much of your career in accessible housing. What do you, in your role as a city councilor, see needing to be addressed for the need for safe, accessible, and affordable housing in our city?
So I feel like every time I start to talk about affordable housing, I always need like another 4 hours. I think that there's a couple of places I would start. I think, and you'll hear this from other candidates as well, simply using the term affordable housing is one drop in the bucket. We use terms like AMI, which is area median income, to identify what HUD, which is the Housing and Urban Development of our federal government. HUD says that 30% of AMI, so you shouldn't be spending more than 30% of your take-home pay on housing. Otherwise, it could be deemed unaffordable. The problem with that is that if we use area median income, as soon as one more person comes into the area and has bazillion dollars, that shifts the area median income. And so it's never, in my mind, never really a fair place to be looking at where we have affordable housing and where we need it. There's a study that will be coming out shortly publicly that says that based on folks' income in Omaha, we are 80,000 units short based on who makes what and what our current housing stock is available. That's 80,000 humans, 80,000 families, I'm sorry, not necessarily like out on the streets and experiencing homelessness, but it means that they're cost burdened, they're rent burdened or mortgage burdened. And so in saying that, I believe that there are ways that the city council, whether it's through zoning, parking minimums, parking maximums, again, redefining TIF is, in the headlines this week, and it will be discussed at tomorrow's city council meeting, looking at ways that we can make sure that our smaller developers can have the same access to tax incentives. When I talk to small developers, the problem that they have is they don't need TIF necessarily. They need capital or help on the front end to be able to start the work. TIF works really well for folks that have the capital on the front end. So that was a winding answer. Michael, to specifically your question, you said the NIMBY hurdle can be insurmountable in many neighborhoods for low income housing. So NIMBY, not in my backyard, is the counter of that is YIMBY, which is yes in my backyard. There's also a fun one. I don't know if any of you have heard YIGBY, which is yes in God's backyard, where churches are starting to use their parking lots or their extra lots and land to build housing. West Omaha has a stigma or has an assumption attached to most of it that most folks in West Omaha have a NIMBY attitude of a not in my backyard. And that's shown when we have development that is brought to the planning board or to the city council that might be apartments, or that might be housing that is, a fourplex. Anything that's not single family often is looked at as a problem in West Omaha. But I don't think that that's actually true. When I talk to voters and when we get down to brass tacks and I ask them questions about their neighborhoods, or even the question, can your teachers afford to live in the neighborhoods where your kids go to school? Can our aging parents afford to stay in their homes based on modifications and weatherization? So, coming back down to just a voter by voter set of values and issues is where I'm having the most in-depth conversations. I think, and Michael, you're probably sitting there, I can't see your face, but you're probably like, that didn't answer my question. And I think it's hard to answer that question with just one pat answer. I think that we have to start somewhere, and we need to start with holding up the smaller developers and giving them equal access to some financing and some incentives that lets them get in the game. The bigger developers don't really have an interest in the smaller projects if they're not going to make money, and that's valid. That's a valid point. But there are small developers all across Omaha. There's a ton in North Omaha that are doing some amazing work right now. And I think that city council can be a part of lifting those folks up and making sure that they've got some financial resources to do the work of developing affordable housing. That was a lot of words.
I love it. And I think just to note to punctuate some of your points, that 80,000 unit shortage, like that doesn't just stay stagnant, right? Like if we look into 2050,
it grows.
That's going to exponentially grow if we don't continue to do something about it. And I think one of the things that I think a lot, and you and I have had conversations about, Naomi, is that it's going to take not only the city council and the mayor's office and these public entities, it also is working with those smaller developers and some of the bigger developers in those public-private partnerships, and how do we make it work for everyone so that we have a common goal, because I'm kind of the old adage of high tide lifts all boats, and affordable housing and making sure that everyone has a safe and accessible and affordable home. As you are currently working on in your current work, it's 3 times as more expensive for a taxpayer once someone gets into the homelessness service system to get them out of it than it would be if we just kept them in a safe and accessible home. So
Well, and I think to that point too, Alex, there are ways that we can look at the affordable housing issue without it just being about building more homes. So we have great housing stock in Omaha, but it's also old. And so if we can look at ways to, I mean, there's cities across the nation that have tool banks, whether that's a nonprofit or whether that's a city-led initiative. What I hear from landlords in North Omaha, especially, is if I'm going to go make repairs on a home, it takes me 20 minutes to go to Home Depot because there's nothing nearby. I do my shopping. By the time I drive 20 minutes back to my rental unit, that's half of my day, and so there's just some simple things that I think we can start looking at and having conversation around. Wills and estate planning, which normally wouldn't seem like something that goes along with affordable housing, I feel super passionate about. If we've got folks that are in homes, whether it's generationally owned or they're the homeowner, making sure, I mean, we could do a citywide campaign to make sure that folks have their wills in place so that the homeownership transfers down generationally. From a city standpoint with the assessors, this is county, but there's a transfer of deed at death that folks aren't usually very aware of, that makes sure that you have determined who gets that house at the time of your death. And so a lot of homes leave the homeownership space because of lack of knowledge. And so there's some city campaigns that I think that we can do to help change that.
Definitely. And speaking of estate planning, on a personal note, that's something that Naomi lives out that value, as she sent me drafts for my spouse and I, as we're homeowners and business owners. That is not always fun for us to think about. And to your point, Naomi, I think there's also folks may not realize that the historic consequences of redlining in our city. And so you mentioned folks who are in North and South Omaha. Those are severely redlined areas, and you can still, if you overlay a map of the redlining from the Housing Authority in the early 1900s to now what the demographics of our city looks like, they're still very, very similar. And a lot of families are also facing that appraisal gap of saying, this is what our house is worth, but these are all of the repairs that are going to be needed for our home to make it accessible and livable. And so I think, again, it's those public-private partnerships and even working with the philanthropic sector to make sure that folks can stay in neighborhoods that they would prefer to live in.
Well, and I think, Alex, there's another thing that you just brought up. This kind of goes to estate planning and wills and generational stuff. I think it's also time, again, to talk about redefining. The more conversations we can have with each other about what it is that defines the way that we live as families. Like, for example, my husband and I are a 2-household family. His career has him in a different state than me and the family here in Omaha. And so we are choosing to have our kids stay put here with roots, and he lives in a different state. And that is normal. That's okay. And I think that we need to have more conversations around, what does it look like? Does it look like grandma and grandpa come to live, or grandma and grandma come to live, or, caretaking for someone else's children, multi-generational, just different ways that we can look at how does housing benefit us when we can decide how it looks. And so things like an ADU, which is an accessory dwelling unit, where you put a second home, sometimes a tiny home, on your property. There's just so many different ways we could dice up the affordable housing thing. But the one thing I would say is, the more we can have conversations with each other about what our normal or what our lived experience is, the more that I think we can connect with each other outside of politics.
Definitely. Yeah, our wonderful neighbors that live down the street are looking for a home for, it's a couple with their young son, and then they're looking to move into a space with their brother and sister-in-law. So it's, so yeah, just what is normal to you is what's normal to you, and that there is no value judgments on what folks need or choose in the ways they did that. And I just watched your beautiful closing to that question, so I apologize. But I think kind of one of the things that keeps bubbling up in our conversation today is there's, you know, a vast division of opinions and ideologies on a national level, but also a lack of unison on the local level as well. Can you chat about how you see yourself as a city councilor, being a representative for all Omahans?
That's a very good question. So there are 7 districts in the Omaha City Council. Each one is represented by one person, and then there's the mayor, of course. And the mayor has is a strong mayor situation in Omaha, so the mayor has veto right. What I think we've seen in the City Council in years past is a very passive and reactive City Council. And I think that as a result of that, a lot of times what you have is don't vote on that if it's not your district, or don't have an interest on that if it's not your district. So I've watched city council meetings where someone from West Omaha is basically kind of hushed because they don't understand North Omaha, or vice versa. Or, you know, there's just some division there. And I think that looking forward to this next election, there are so many great candidates across the city council that we are bound to have some really cool progressive change get elected in May. And so I think you'll start to see more of a one Omaha take finally in 2021. People ask me all the time which mayoral candidate I'm rooting for, and my answer to that is I'm here to help whoever that city council, however that looks, and whoever the mayor is, to build on what's actually a legacy instead of just administrating a city. Let's bring the heart back into the heartland and make this truly an Omaha where it's for everyone. The challenge in that is that until we start having some awareness around what issues all Omahans face, I can't, assuming that I'm elected, I can't sit in that seat and not bring up affordable housing when it comes to that. I can't not champion making sure that our community services grants are available for kids that are aging out of the foster care system or reentry from being incarcerated. Like, we just have to have our city council issues be more humanity based and less district based. How that's actually going to look, I don't know, but I'm feeling confident that there's going to be some folks on that city council come June that'll be there for that conversation. So I'm excited about that. And I'm just going to address, Michael just put in the chat, how is Omaha's scorecard on dealing with the homeless situation? It's interesting. When we lived overseas, 3 years in India, and the thing about India is that it's everything all at once. So it's great wealth and great beauty in the midst of great tragedy and poverty. And sometimes it's flipped. Sometimes the tragedy is in the wealth and sometimes the beauty is in the poverty, but it's all at once. And I think that cities like Omaha have done such a good job, and I say good in quotes, of hiding anything that's not beautiful or that doesn't perpetuate Omaha being a good place to raise a family. The problem with that, though, is that there's nothing ugly or wrong with the folks that are experiencing homelessness. And we sometimes paint the issue or the situation and add the human into that. So I think that our scorecard in dealing with it is that we do a good job of brushing it aside, making sure that it's not visible. In the project that I'm working on, it is standing up hotel sites so that folks that otherwise could not be in a homeless shelter, a traditional homeless shelter, whether that's because of COVID capacity for social distancing protocol or because they wouldn't otherwise be served in a homeless shelter. And we're going to be at full capacity within a week. And that goes to show you that maybe we've done a good job if you look at the scorecard as being, is it invisible and is it a problem that we can't see? Then I think you could say Omaha's done fine. The beauty of the project that I'm working on is that because we are leveraging city, county, state, and federal money and local nonprofit expertise and local philanthropy, we'll be able to see this project going into the summer, flipping very nicely into figuring out affordable housing. So I'm excited about that work. yeah, I don't know. I don't know if that answered the way you were asking the question, Michael, but I think Omaha has done a good job of hiding it, and it's time, and enough people are aware of what we need to do in the future so that we can actually attack it and start really being true to our need and mission to end homelessness in Omaha.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you said bringing the heart back into the heartland, and I love that. And I think that's something that, you know, like, again, from living in a small town and in a rural city, you know, folks who are housing burdened, or who are federally defined as poor and low income, they're our neighbors, right? They go to our schools, and kind of everyone knows who they are, right? But then when we get into communities that we live in now, it really has become an invisible problem. And so it's we don't want to uplift folks who are homelessness and say, like, look at these poor people. It says this is a need that we have to care for the people in our community, and we are the heartland, and why would we let our fellow folks be in unnecessary pain, right?
Well, and I think that's a good segue to also talk a little bit about language access. In the work that I'm doing, we had warming centers. You know, it's hard to believe that tomorrow it's going to be 45 degrees when last week we were 40 below with the wind chill. Warming centers are typically stood up in like Salvation Armies and different locations across Omaha. The problem is that with COVID, we needed to have more of them this year because we couldn't just pack folks into a shelter. And so part of what I really prioritized was making sure that the flyers for the information about the warming centers were translated. We did 12 languages, and I got a lot of feedback from people saying that they were surprised to see so many languages. And I asked why, and they said, well, I didn't know we had that many languages in Omaha. And I was like, well, that's just the tip of the iceberg. We have hundreds of languages and dialects of people that live in Omaha. And the second thing that we were talking about then that got brought up was that we don't see folks that don't need English as their first language in the homelessness system. And my challenge back was, is that because you aren't providing services in a language that they can understand? If they know that they're not going to be served by the language that is their first language or their preferred language, would you show up if you knew someone couldn't communicate with you? Or would you fall back on your own resources in your own community? So there's some space there too for the city to ramp up its language access. When we saw our public utilities send information out about the rolling blackouts, it was in one language, which is unfortunate also. So that also permeates into West Omaha and our school districts. When I was doing rental assistance last year, a lot of the assumption was that they didn't need to tell folks in West Omaha. And I was like, that is not the truth. There are folks all across Omaha that would be in need of rental and mortgage assistance. So, I think it's just, again, awareness, talking more openly about what resources are available, making sure that our school superintendents that are not OPS are in close communication with the people doing the work on the ground in our communities so that they know what resources are available to their kiddos is also super important.
Yeah.
Just how Renee
did. Yeah, and I am fortunate to see some of the work being done in OPS. And last I looked, and this number could have changed because I think it was in 2019, but there were 93 languages and dialects just spoken in the Omaha Public School District. And so I think language access across the board, right? You've said in plain language, and there's using acronyms and things like that for a layperson just in Omaha to understand policy, but then these different languages and dialects. And then I think that goes further into systems and in empowering folks in communities who could utilize their skills and be translators. I know that's another huge barrier for folks is written word, but then also once you get into the services, how are you able to communicate with staff who need to help you and need to understand your situation? And so there's always things for us to continue to work on, right? And so, this has been another thread of our conversation and of your campaign. And so equity is one of the priorities that you have stated about your campaign. And would you mind defining equity for this group, as well as how the power of the city council can influence the equity that exists or does not currently exist in the city?
Yeah, so equity to me is that by virtue of nature or reality or by law, that it's just. And so if you kind of break that apart, equity means that we all have the same access to a thing. And I'm sure some of you have seen, there's an example where some folks are watching a baseball game and there's a fence between the folks and the baseball game. And so equality is giving everyone the box that's the same size to stand on, to say, here, now you can watch the game. Here's your equal right to watch the game. Equity is when you understand what the person needs, what size box they need. Someone might not need a box where someone else might need a bigger box, or someone might need steps to get onto the box in the first place. So I think equity is just being aware of looking at the whole person or the whole family or the whole situation to understand what it is that they need to be able to exist in the same way that everyone else does as well. I get a lot of questions around equity in schools, equity in things like minimum wage, and a lot of that is outside of City Council's overview. But what I know I can do is say, if you're asking me questions about minimum wage, here's the phone number or the email address for your state legislature, state rep. Here is the phone number to how to reach your congressman's aides. And I think the second step of that too is walking people through practice rounds of what to say when you call your state legislator or your congressman or congresswoman or congressperson. I think that goes back to that shame. There's some scariness around calling folks. What do I think that equity, like I think the biggest pieces for equity come into play when we talk about transportation. I think it comes into play when we talk about making sure that we are prioritizing mental health responders to go along with some of our police calls. Equity means that we have done everything that we can to diversify our fire and our police recruiting. It also means that we prioritize our disabled community in ways that either is access to buildings or access to transportation. It really can be a lens that we look at everything, honestly. I think it also comes into play when we look at things like community services grants, which if you're not familiar with those, the two very common ones in Omaha are PACE, which is the Police Athletics, what does the CE stand for?
Community engagement.
Thank you. And Step Up. They're both great programs and they're both 10 years old. So equity is going to be the way that we decide what are the next community services grants that we prioritize, and is it what's equitable for Omaha. Yeah, I think equity is really the lens that we need to be putting across everything. And, you know, I think that our current city councilors, a great example is Zoom access to be able to testify at city council meetings. And I was thrilled to see Councilor Festerson bring a request to let people testify by Zoom. The next thing I would have loved for him to do, though, was to not say that it was because of a trend, but because it allowed equitable access to government. So we'll get there. It's baby steps, right? Yeah.
I have also sine when you're talking about that graphic, right, of the image of equity, and it's like, why don't we just take the fence down? Why does there need to be a fence there, right? And I think when we think about accessibility, it's also like, why do we have there's a requirement for you to lift 50 pounds in a job description? For those of us who work behind a desk, when's the last time you had to lift 50 pounds? And that could immediately just write off anyone who has a physical disability from being able to apply for your job if you still are requiring all of those things. Same thing with driver's license, right? And just anecdotally, my wife is actually your hairdresser and the hairdresser of several folks on this call. And she had to go to school for over a year to be a cosmetologist and to be able to hold shears and cut people's hair and do nails and all those things, and folks who have a police officer position don't have to have as much, and social workers have to have four years of a degree and then hundreds of hours of practicum. And so I think thinking about how our public servicemen are trained in the education that they have is really super important. And I think another one of the things that I've talked to Sarah Smolin, who's a candidate for District 4, is that the City Council has approved the police union contract for the next 4 years or whatever it is. So then the folks who are inheriting that are going to be stuck with it. And so I think it'll be an interesting challenge for you all as you take on and hear from folks who are really passionate about a lot of these issues. So thank you, Naomi. I did want to highlight CJ had to leave, but he encouraged folks to sign up to vote by mail. And Naomi, you might be able to speak to this a little bit more, but he mentioned that candidates get those lists of who are registered ballots, and it's helpful in targeting GOTV, which is get out the vote efforts, and encouraging everyone to vote by mail. Yeah.
Well, and I think so there's a really good example of equitable access, right? So vote by mail often is looked at as a way for candidates to have kind of early buy-in. So early voting in the Omaha municipality election starts on March 22nd. You can start voting in person on March 22nd at the Election Commission, or you can, that's when the vote by mail ballots will be starting to be sent out. What's interesting about those is that vote by mail has long served folks where there's accessibility needs. And so again, the disabled community, people for whom their work does not let them go on voting day for whatever reason. If there's kiddo issues, or if you're a caregiver, there's just so many humans that vote by mail really is a benefit. And so it's not just a casual nice thing to have. It's imperative that we have vote by mail as an option. You can request your application to vote by mail. There's a green card that you can get in the mail that should have already come if you're on the permanent roll, or you can go to the Douglas County Election Commission website and you can request it. You can send it in by fax, by email, you can take a picture of it. There's all sorts of ways to do it, which is really great. And we'll have applications too. So if anyone on the call knows of places that we can drop off stacks of the vote by mail applications, we'd be happy to do that from our campaign. And it really does help folks that need to be able to have that access, and candidates as well.
Great, thank you. So we have a few minutes, and Dana mentioned, I mentioned that the contract was approved for the police union for a significant amount of time.
Yep.
And so he's wondering about amending, reviewing the police contract, and if we can't amend that contract, are there other things that are within the purview of the city council, or that we can build in community organizing that seeks to address the reform and changes within the police culture, the systems that they or ways that processes that they handle calls, and kind of that whole conversation.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to, it sounds like a glib response, but I think it goes back to diversifying the way that we recruit. If we have classes of candidates, both for police and fire, that are more diverse, and I don't mean just the way that they present racially, lived experience, languages spoken, folks that have worked through, struggle with mental health. Like, I just think that the more that we can diversify who is showing up to say, I would like to be on the police force, would be huge. Second to that then, or equal to that, is absolutely ensuring that we have anti-bias training. I have gone through 3 rounds of very intense implicit bias training, and I showed up the first time thinking I didn't have any implicit bias. How could I possibly, right? Like I've had, hardship, I'm Black, I'm white, like all these things. How could I possibly have implicit bias? And I do, we all do. And so I think that mandating that and having it be regular and something that people do on a regular basis with our police and fire is important. There is an amazing group out of Wichita that has something called HOT, and it provides mental health response from a community outreach perspective for when police calls are made. I think that's great. There's also a program called STAR in Denver, and then Cahoots out of Eugene, Oregon. So there's some other places that aren't LA or Chicago or New York. You know, they're not big, huge metropolis. These are smaller areas that are doing things that we could mimic in Omaha. And I think the other thing too is just honestly, and this again sounds a little surfacey, but opening the lines of communication with our police force. When I sent the warming center flyers to the public information officer, Lieutenant Cherie Thomas, and said, can you please make sure that your officers have this either on their phones or in some way so that if they encounter someone on the street, they at least can provide options for safe shelter. I asked, you know, what do you do if the police encounter someone when it's 20 below zero outside, and they don't really have the resources they need. So we need to be able to step that up. To more of a intentional response to the police reform conversation, I think that there are, it's bigger than one 4-year term for a city councilor to address some of the deeper stuff that we need to be looking at. But we need to first be able to be willing to say that racism exists in Omaha and that it impacts the way that our policing happens. Not a good cop, bad cop discussion. It's just that racism exists and it impacts our policing. If we can get more comfortable with saying that from an elected official standpoint, I can only imagine that we would start to make some of the necessary steps. I hear a lot that people want to do participatory budgeting as an answer to big police budgets. And I think the one thing that I would say is in researching participatory budgeting, it's complicated, and there hasn't really been anyone who has done it successfully. And so I always say, like, let's have a bigger conversation about what that would actually mean and what it would take to implement that in our city. We're going to be doing a participatory campaign fundraising effort in the next month, which will be interesting. And what that means is that you would be able to say, I'm going to give you $20 and I want you to spend it in this way. And we'll be accountable to then report back on how that money was spent. And it'll be a kind of an interesting example to see, can we do something like that at a city county level? Can we give folks $1 per resident? You and I have talked about this, Alex. Can it be something where we take community service grant money and we let the districts decide what their area needs the most? So there's all sorts of ways we can do it. I have other things to say about the police contract, but I won't. I'll stop there.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. Yeah, I think participatory budgeting is a heavy lift, and I think you're right that it's going to take more than a 4-year term to address a lot of these things. But I think one of the, you and I were in trainings together, Naomi, and I think one of the things that I've really learned for and internalized myself over the last year is, we are taught that racism is like a personal ilk, and it's a personal and thing that's in your heart that is only to you. And I think what we are coming to learn is that racism is this big thing that is in every part of our lives and is every part of this, our country, our county, our city, all of these things. And so if it's not that we are saying you are a bad person, it's saying that there's this thing that is, we all have to be accountable for, right? And just because you have a marginalized identity, that doesn't mean that you don't have all of these things. So we have about 3 minutes left. If there's not any last questions. I just wanted to, Naomi, leave the opportunity open to, how do we support you?
Well, I want to make sure, Jan, did you come off of camera? Did you have a question? No, okay. So my email is hello@Naomi for City Council. My phone number is 402-885-9224. I am very, very happy to have a chat with anyone who has questions, who has passion around this. The thing that we're most looking for right now is help with reaching voters. And so what that looks like during a pandemic is getting on the phones and calling voters. We also have a way that you can text them for folks that don't want to have to talk to someone. And then for folks that are able to, we also have literature drop opportunities where you go door to door. You don't knock, but you just stick one of my flyers in the door. I spent a couple of hours this morning phone banking, and most times it's voicemails that you're leaving. So it's super fast and super easy. This kind of a forum really gets me energized because it allows me to share my beliefs, my ideas. So if you're wanting to host one yourself, I'd love to do that with your friends or your network. And then it looks like Alex has dropped all of the things in the chat. Ways to get a hold of us, fundraising, all of the things. We are in a very short cycle. So early voting starts March 22nd. The primary is April 6th. I will automatically go through because there's just the two of us. And then the final election is May 11th. So it might seem like a long time, but every day is super crucial that we are able to contact voters. So thanks for having me, Renee. Thanks for organizing this. This was wonderful.
You are so welcome, you guys. Alex, you did a wonderful job interviewing. Thank you so much. And Naomi, thank you for what you're doing. I am a fourth generation Elkhornian, and it's a tough conversation that we need to have in our community because I've witnessed it, I've seen it, I've heard it, I was taught it. And these people are wonderful people. They just don't understand. I think the lack of education is there for a lot of people here in the Elkhorn area. We are wonderful people. There are tremendous families in this area, but I feel like we lack on communication and knowledge socially. So thank you so much. I appreciate it. And our platform is where excess meets need, and you can never get too much knowledge, right?
I love that.
That's always so. Thank you guys so much.
Well, and one of the core values of this campaign is also just let's do it messy, right? So I can promise the conversation, and I can promise not a lack of judgment and a lack of shame, but we have to first be willing to step together and have that conversation, even if it's messy and even if it feels awkward. And I think that, to your point, Renee, the more that we can just say, hey, I've been wondering about this, or I heard this and I have some questions. And I like to think that I can offer that space to be able to have some of those chats. So I'm here. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Awesome.
Okay.
What a great lunch and learn. I've learned a lot. I appreciate it. And if I could take this link and if I could put it on Urban Butterfly Facebook and our page, I'd appreciate that as well. And we can spread the news as fast as we can.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Bye, guys. Have a great day.
Enjoy.
Bye. Thanks so much.